Hey, everybody. Top of the evening to you from beautiful downtown suburbs of Tempe. And I'm here with our weekly Fearless Flight live show with Dieter Staudinger up in Toronto and Diane Hansen up in the north part of Phoenix, and Eric just down the road from me in South Phoenix, I guess we call it. So. And this is the place where you go if you have a fear of flying, or if you know somebody who does, or maybe you just want to hear us tell lies about flying in airplanes. Any of those are good enough reasons to join us every week. And we do welcome you to contribute. So if you, whether you're live watching this or after the fact, if you have a question or a comment, please put it in Facebook there. And because we'll scour those things and look for connections. There was speaking of Facebook, there was a comment this week, and I don't remember the person, but it was real touching. And a lot of people commented about a young lady whose boyfriend or fiance has a pretty significant fear of flying, and she put in there how she kind of apologized for in the past for not being quite so aware of that, and I thought that was really cool. And so we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. We're going to go back to the basics a little bit tonight. The next thing we talk about is our Facebook group. It's a private group, and like the rest of Fearless Flight, it's going to be changing here. We're going to do try to more actively engage the folks, other than just look at the comments from week to week like we have been. And by default, Eric is now a member of the Facebook world. So we're going to get some comments from
Very
him.
charitably said. Now I want to come over and smack you.
Yeah. So anyway, so we're just going to talk about it, just kind of an overview of what's it all about if you're afraid to fly. And as I reiterate there, ask a question or leave a comment. There is still time to register for the Clear for Takeoff 201 class. I just posted the replay for last week's first webinar, but unlike past classes, now we have a student portal up there where you can go in and start your own study by virtue of entering the portal. And we're using the webinars to kind of coalesce all the information up to that point, which is nice because we don't have to enter the webinar thinking that we've got to give you a drink with a garden hose or a fire hose every week and overwhelm you, which is not a good way to learn and not good for your anxiety as well. So anyway, Dieter's going to put the link in chat for that, and we have a couple of items that happened in the industry, just a couple of them just today, I believe, and Diane has a couple of experiences from flying this past week there. So with that, let's see, where do we want to go with this? Let's just talk about a couple of things that happened. Let's do the aviation update next, Eric. We'll save the basics for last. So you said somebody blew a tire or a couple of tires today?
Yeah, it shocked me. I just in the news feed, and I couldn't get it back. 30 minutes prior to the show, an airplane taking off, a 737 taking off from Miami for Phoenix, aborted takeoff and had two tires blow. And because of reporting, we don't know if they rejected the takeoff because the tires blew out or the tires blew out during the rejected takeoff. And this kind of thing, when Ron was a young buck, used to be, would come up once in a while and got more and more infrequent and almost unheard of when I was a captain because of high quality tires, high quality brakes, temperature monitoring, that kind of stuff. But really the only two ways that could happen is that the airplane landed and did a quick turn and had a large amount of heat energy stored in the brakes, and they went to take off and rejected the takeoff and added the heat energy from the rejected takeoff to the latent heat energy, and the tires popped, or that they rejected the takeoff at an exceedingly high rate of speed, too fast, and the tires absorbed too much energy. And when they say the tires blew, that's always how it is reported. But what in fact happens is the tires have fusible plugs in them, so that when the heat causes the pressure in the tires to be too high, they will blow out the fusible plugs and deflate rather than explode, because that's what would happen in the past. And if people were around them on the ground, it would kill them. So however, either way, if the brake assembly absorbed too much heat energy, the fusible plugs would pop and the tires would deflate. And there's not a clear enough reporting of exactly what happened on that takeoff now to determine why that happened. But that's very unusual, very infrequent.
I just see it was an American from JFK to Phoenix, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me. JFK, Miami, almost the same thing.
Yeah.
So the tires can fail as a result of their own whatever failure, mechanical failure or material failure, and they can fail as a result of trying to stop on the runway for if they had aborted for some other reason. So, and oh geez, I was just going to say
For those
something.
geeks that are on YouTube, there are these really amazing documentaries about.
Uh-oh.
Bless you.
Bless you, Captain Eric.
It's too late to mute myself.
He literally
left-
blew himself off the stage there.
There we go.
Wow, I thought you left the property there, Eric. Man. Anyway, hey, Eric, how would I know if I'm flying if the tire did blow?
Am I speaking again? I muted myself for a second. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was what we call a rapid depressurization. We'll talk about that next week. A lot of the airplanes now have monitors in the cockpit that are monitoring brake temperatures monitors, and you can tell when they're getting real hot, too hot to attempt to take off, whether cooling measures have to be taken, and many of the modern airplanes have brake fans purely for the purposes of cooling the brakes. And in an extreme situation down low, the landing gear can be lowered, and the airplane flown with the landing gear lowered in order to cool off the brakes to keep from transmitting those high temperatures to tires.
And why might we want to discontinue the takeoff just for a blown tire?
If we did, that becomes a tricky thing in terms of performance wise. But if we did that and that happened, we might be aware that there was a lot of heat energy in that gear assembly, and we would not want to retract it into the wheel well where it's out of the airflow and next to hydraulic fuel pumps, other kinds of things. We might not want to take that problem with us.
And the other thing I was thinking of is if it did not blow through the fuse plugs and it actually had a failure, then it might be spit it out in front and go down the engine. So that's
Sure,
something.
that would be catastrophic if the fuse
Yeah.
did not depressurize the tire. Absolutely.
So if you're a passenger, what you might expect if in any rejected takeoff is kind of a fun day at Disneyland. Because if you think we put on the brakes and do aggressive stopping with normal thrust reverse, it gets really excited if it was close to the V1 speed, which you may or may not remember is the speed at which we decide whether we're going to continue or whether we're going to stop in the remaining runway. So you're likely to some of those people went back to the gate. Certainly they're all going to be fluttered a little bit at the beginning, and we can only hope that the airline, at least perhaps the pilot, said a little something to everybody, said, hey, you can check we're all alive, and we're going to have somebody look us over out here before we even pull back into the gate area. and don't you worry, because otherwise you can risk internalizing that, and now you become one of our future clients. So, and not that we don't love you all, we just assume you didn't have to go through that. So,
But to
anyway.
My
reiterate,
captain talked about that in what my event was. He was very good about it.
What was that?
My captain with my
Oh.
little event made
And so talk about your little friend.
my little event. I had a 4-day trip this last week, and the first leg of it was going from Phoenix to Idaho Falls. And I was the forward flight attendant, which means my jump seat is right on the other side of the flight deck door, right next to the main cabin door on my regional jet. And we took off, and shortly after takeoff, there started a very loud screeching noise around the main cabin door. And it got worse. And of course, we were still in sterile flight deck, which means you guys up front were still doing stuff. And unless there was an emergency, we don't call you as flight attendants. But that was more of an emergency. And so I called, and the pilot and the first officer both heard the screech. And it was so loud, you could hear it apparently all the way down to the back of the aircraft. And it was getting worse. And I explained to the pilot, to the captain, about the noise, what the pitch was, what the general sound was, that I was not lightheaded. I did not have any problem breathing. So there was no concern on my part about any rapid decompression, but it was certainly an abnormal sound. And so we went back and forth, the captain and I, and then he called me back after he had talked to the people he needed to talk to back in Phoenix. And we turned back because it was a failure of the seal in the main cabin door. But he, as I was saying, and as Ron was saying, that he hoped that other captains said, that my captain was very proactive and described what we were going through, what we were doing. We were going back to Phoenix, why, and all of that other sort of thing. And so when we got back there, we wound up switching aircraft. Everybody had to deplane. We did that, and they wound up, the seal was cracked and it had to be replaced by maintenance. So we demonstrated the CRM, lots of communication between me and the other flight attendant, who was brand new. She was brand new flight attendant, and the pilots and the passengers, and then me and the passengers. And it was fine. Everything was fine. I told you guys.
Did you lose any passengers?
Not a one. I did have one as we were going back, obviously, to make sure everybody's seatbelt was securely fastened, and a double check on that. And one of the passengers in first class wanted to know, she said, were you freaked out? And I said, no, I wasn't freaked out. I said I was concerned. That's whenever you hear something that's not normal, that is a concern. And it's certainly a concern around the ceiling, around the main cabin door. That is obviously a concern and a reason for us to go back and change planes. But no, I wasn't. I was, as you have described before, you get startled, and then we come right back down, and I knew what the sound was. I had a good sense of what the sound was. And so no,
and that's
another day.
And that's because of training and everything. So,
Right.
So the parallel is that if we're going to talk about, the basic steps to overcoming your fear of flying. If you all take the same approach that we do in training as crew members, so you're going to get over it yourself. Yeah. There's two things that happen as a pilot and a flight attendant. If you had any anxiety, you educate that out of your system. And two, you keep exposing yourself to the same stimuli, and eventually your brain kind of gets tired out there. So we had as I moved into a job of kind of debriefing people after incident stuff, we had a 757 that had a fire warning light after V1, so they continued the takeoff. and got airborne, got safely airborne. And when you have a fire warning, all you have to do initially is just reduce the thrust on there, and they didn't even have to go back to idle. So they were able to get the fire extinguisher or the fire light, the overheat light, to go out. But then they were obligated to turn right around and come back. So they came back around and they landed. And so the situation I got involved in was about 2 months afterwards. And ironically, I had one of the flight attendants, there were 4 flight attendants on an airplane, and one of them had gone through my class, and I recognized her from training. And so I asked her about it. So she told me a little bit about it. But then when we had this big formal hearing, it was because all 4 flight attendants had not returned to flying at that point. And one of them didn't think she would ever go back. So they were all traumatized. And so we had a bunch of people in the hearing, including the supervisor, the flight attendant supervisor, who was on duty that day. And we had the first officer. We didn't have the captain. He couldn't make it. But anyway, so we were debriefing that, and the focus was pretty much on the flight attendants. And so they were all asked as to why. Well, one of the questions was why they continued. If in fact, after the fact, they were having difficulty going back to work and flying. And it was speculated, because of the rules at the time, that flight attendants did not get paid if they didn't fly that. So everybody assumed that it was because the flight attendants didn't want to not get paid that day. And so when they interviewed them, it was really, really revealing. Not that revealing to people who work with PTSD, but the reason that they all, and this was like a 3-hour delay, they ended up going in a different airplane. And virtually everybody went, and it was from Phoenix to Baltimore, so it was a long leg. And the reason that the flight attendants elected to continue on the trip was because they bonded with the passengers and they wanted to see them through. And everybody was really kind of gobsmacked by that. And the supervisor there, he was kind of a young fellow and hadn't a whole lot of practical online experience. And he kind of was offended by the fact, and he said in the hearing, he said, well, I asked you guys if you were okay to fly, and we pointed out that the last person to ask after a traumatic situation is a person who's been traumatized, because you're the least capable of evaluating your own condition to go on. So anyway,
well,
but
I will say that all of my passengers, when they deplaned in Phoenix, and then we got to the next aircraft and we got them all boarded. Everybody was wonderful. They were all, they were all fine. They said thank you, and so I tried to lighten the mood a little bit. So my first announcement, because I'm forward, is, ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard again. And of course, everybody started laughing, and it was, that's what needs to happen. It's just to lighten the mood just a little bit. So yeah.
And as you said, a combination between the pilots and the crew probably did more to reduce the anxiety for people like that. Yeah. Because the more, I think it's like when you get airborne and the sooner after takeoff that you turn around and go back, the more traumatic it can be, because people tend to think that, oh my gosh,
oh my gosh, yeah.
What if we could have died and all that? And so when you give them a straightforward excuse or reason for that, really so.
The obvious question before we move on, because it was in the comments, is, doesn't that stuff get checked often? And I guess the answer is not often enough for the very few times something like that occurs. Would that be correct?
Well,
yeah. Well, if you consider every day pre-pandemic, if you have 105 departures every day, not going to be a whole lot that are rejected.
Yeah.
Are we talking about door seals or tires, or what? Are we talking about door seals? How often is that?
Yeah. So
well, any reason
with Diane's experience.
Yeah. I mean, it could have cracked right then. The crack. I mean, it could have been fine, and then when I closed the door in Phoenix, it may have just failed at that moment. You don't know.
I have no idea what the inspection interval is on a door seal. None.
But here's the deal: if you hear the squeal and don't hear the next sound of boom, the door blowing out, you're okay.
You're okay. Yeah.
And
that's why I told the pilot I wasn't lightheaded. I wasn't. There was no change as far as I could tell. Of course,
And we basically put door seals in there so that the squeal doesn't annoy you when we pressurize, because it's like a pinhole in a balloon, and the tighter it is and the more the pressure in the cabin, or the greater the pressure in the cabin, the greater the squeal.
Yeah.
So it's pretty much a customer service thing. And because when we take off, on takeoff, matter of fact, we do slightly pressurize the cabin so the door doesn't rattle, because that's not something that people are comfortable with.
I don't even like listening to the rattles.
There's no chance. I hate to say, I know just what you guys are thinking. I know just what you're thinking. There's no chance, zero, that you're going to get sucked out of the door. It's not going to happen. But what you do in the cockpit is you count to 3 slowly: 1 Mississippi, 2 Amazon, 3 Ganges. And if the increasing pressure doesn't make it like a balloon pop into the detent and seal it up, it's not going to fix itself. So there's no point in continuing and not going back, because as Ron said, as the pressure goes higher, this squeal will have various permutations of a cat getting its nails done in a Turkish prison and a monkey concert, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So there's no point hoping that it will get better, because it won't. But you will not get sucked. Raise your right hand. You will not.
I know. The only concern if I had any concern, was that I was going to lose a lot of my hearing.
Oh yeah.
The sound got worse and worse the higher we went. I mean, it's
very loud, and then it gets worse, no doubt.
It's piercing. What?
So two takeaways are: one, this is, I would say, half of the people that I coach who are concerned about the structural integrity of an airplane. At some point during the session, they say, "What's the worst that you've ever had, Captain Ron?" And they all hope that I'll come back and say that I was sucked halfway out of the cockpit window or something like that, and then recovered. But the fact is, it's boring for the most part. And the second takeaway is the fact that the real answer to Dieter's question that he referred there is that things just don't happen of any sort to cause us to reject the flight or abort in air, and even less so on the runway before we get to V1. It just doesn't happen. And if you count those those are, certainly greater than anybody that would have a crash or a fatal accident on that. And you can see how really remote, you can see why we get to 1 in 33.2 million are your chances of dying in an airplane crash. It just doesn't happen. So, okay.
And I think we were talking about that before the show. The incidents that have, risen sharply were all human incidents, with having to do with composure, having to do with the ability to calm yourself. And unruly passengers, you could argue, are not very calm and not very collected. And so that's what's on the rise. It's not that the aircrafts are getting any more unsafe or anything. It's the ability of humans to keep themselves in a good space while they are traveling from A to B using aircraft. So, and I think that's why our show is so important, to point that out. It's not about the plane, it's what's going on inside of us that's far more revealing in some ways, especially when we're talking about, I think, the fearless flight method, Ron, that you wanted to get into, right? So
yeah. Well, let's go to slide number 5, Dieter, and we'll just talk about briefly. This is the what we call the fearless flight method, and it's the way you're going to get beyond where you're at. And that is to start with by educating yourself. And that's what we try to do here every week. It's what we try to do in coaching. It's what we try to do with the classes like the 201 that's currently going on right now, because you have to know more than what you did before. If you continually hope that some divine intervention is going to take place in your mind and composure between the last time you had a miserable experience and your next flight, you're likely to be very, very disappointed. And because people don't know what to do, and the fact that an anxiety disorder is such an abstract type of a malady, that's why people don't get better. But when you start focusing on education stuff, just like when you listen to stories like Diane here, and you realize that number one, the crews are trained. We all get surprised, but we do. We not sublimate, but we expose ourselves to routine hours of routine flights, and we're trained in the likely things that could have gone wrong or serious things that have gone wrong in the past. And you can do the same way. Do you need to know enough to be a flight attendant or pilot? Absolutely not. But do you need to listen to it somewhat so that you can, when you're having anxiety due to something about flying, you can have a little part of you that counters that elephant brain, that catastrophic or catastrophizing part of your brain, and says, well, I don't remember exactly what those guys said on Fearless Flight, but I do remember that I was comfortable with their explanation. And that's how you move on. The next thing, and this number two here, this is what's going to get you on a flight sooner rather than later. And that's your ability to learn to either disrupt your thinking or distract your thinking. Because if you can, the difference between you and the person sitting next to you who has a fear of flying or who doesn't have a fear of flying is the quantity or the quality and the content of what they're thinking. They're not thinking about how badly they feel. They're not thinking about, geez, I wished I had listened to my inner sense and not got on that airplane today. They're thinking about, and I often say, if you're like me, a former pilot, you know, what I'm going to eat the next time, because that's what we did in our family when we got bored. We found something to eat. But that's what you do. And so sometimes the way you disrupt that is to consciously, mindfully think of factual things about flying that would counter the crazy thought that wants to take place in your mind at that point in time. Other times you could do something like listen to the flight harmonizer or listen to recorded audio messages, listen to a book, anything like that. The trouble with many of who are in the early stages of overcoming your fear is that you're not strong enough to blaze a new path, a neuron pathway. You're going to get stuck falling into the old one. And the last thing that we recommend is building social connection. And that's simply getting to know the four of us here by hanging out in the rooms here, in the class or the show each week, hanging out in the classes, getting to meet people in the Facebook, the Birds of a Feather group. And if you take classes online with us, get to meet other people who have a like-minded point of view. And that's why it was so inspiring to young woman kind of make amends to her boyfriend there. I don't know whether he read that or not, but that's what it takes. It takes someone that has empathy for you. And unfortunately, a lot of people are coupled or are friends with people who have no clue what it would be like to be afraid to fly to the extent that many of you are. So you have to find those people. And that's why one of the most often uttered responses when people come to classes is that, gee, I didn't think that, or I thought I was the only one. And you're definitely not the only one. So speaking of learning, the 201 class is still eligible to join if you'd like. We had a couple of people join last week. As I said in the opening remarks, I just updated or uploaded the webinar, the recording, the replay from last week. So you can go back in there, and the content for the entire course before the webinars is available the instant that you complete the registration. It'll take you right over to the portal, the student portal, and you can get to work. And not only can you do that when you join the class, but you'll have that available for 3 months following the class so that you can keep refreshing yourself and keep reinforcing what you learn. So, any other questions out there, Dieter, that have come in?
No, we don't have any other questions, but I just wanted to, if you're not a member of the Birds of a Feather Facebook group, there is a great post in there from somebody who, and I'm coming back to the building social connections and coming back to that feeling of embarrassment and shame. And there's actually a post in there from somebody who is not afraid to fly, who kind of owned up to almost 1,000 people in our Facebook group that she wasn't very supportive to her boyfriend.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier. I don't know if you.
So I just want to hit that home that it goes both ways, and so even if you you know, like I'm just thinking of our 16-year-old, you know, science and math are not a strong suit kind of thing. And it's so easy for somebody who is good at that stuff to say, well, you know, I don't understand. How come you don't know that? But we all have these areas where clearly there is, let's just say, room for improvement. And if we can kind of hold ourselves in that space when our partner has a challenge or when our teenager has a challenge with school, that's the kind of ability that Ron's talking about when we're talking about disrupting or distracting in our second pillar of the fearless flight method. It's really learning how to understand how the feeling, the emotion is driving the thinking machine. And once that engine is powered up, it really, we're often too late to the party at that point. And so it's important to practice when the house isn't on fire, when we're not at the gate, when we're not, you know, and this is the importance of connecting with other fearful flyers or people who have come through. And that's the importance of it. So I just can only reiterate that reaching out, that's probably the hardest part for most of you. And that will also be one of the most rewarding things in a safe and nurturing environment that you can do. So
in week 3, when we talk about coping, we'll talk about what you can do if you're a coach or companion. And I try to cover that when I have coaching students, if their spouse is willing and they're comfortable with it, because there tends to be two reactions. One is, in all cases, the non-flying partner doesn't know what to do. So they feel helpless. And the two responses typically are, one, they'll try to smother them with, that's okay, don't worry about it, all that doesn't help. And in fact, you might get a negative reaction sometimes because people feel like they're being babied or something, and nobody likes that. And the other one is they get frustrated, the people who are not the fearful flyers, and they act out a little bit of anger and stuff. In any case, it doesn't help the relationship. And we'll talk about things that you can do in like I said, in week 3 there. So coming up, we have on February 12th, the next Clear for Takeoff 101. That's our free class in Phoenix. And you can go to the link on the screen coming up there to register if you are or will be in the Phoenix area that evening.
March 12th? Did we mean March 12th?
March, yeah.
Well, it could have been February 12th, but it would make it better if it was March 12th. So that was a challenge to the staff here. Thanks for catching that.
Paying attention.
Yeah. And we won't be doing one on the 13th. We won't be doing that. Well, the next slide did. The next online will be March 6th.
March 6th.
Yeah. So okay. So with that, if I hear a second, we'll end the meeting. So anyway, so
well,
thanks.
I just want to say that Jeff, I appreciate that. Jeff is just putting in the comments that he loves the harmonizer, and must have been interesting in putting it together. And for those of you who don't know, it's we'll let Captain Eric talk about his experience with the harmonizer next time.
Don't do it.
Or not. Wait, so thanks for joining us again this week. We appreciate all of you showing up, and we'll see you again next week for another episode of Fearless Flight Live. So have a great week and stay safe. Bye-bye.